There is absolutely no shortage of blame going around for the current cost of living crisis here in Canada, with opposition parties trying to attach catchy slogans to their explanation for the situation. We've got just inflation, saying that this is the government's fault, so the current Liberal government. We've got greedflation, another explanation that's attached to corporate profits being the reason for inflation, while the Liberal government stands by and says, hey, we're not really responsible for this is a global phenomenon. But a report released just yesterday has some evidence that warns that Canada could be on the wrong path, and it seems to support one of these explanations more than the others. Now, on top of this, there are some shocking numbers in here that show why you could be experiencing a higher rate of inflation than the measly 6.9% that is currently reported on the CPI. So let's talk about what this new report says and who it claims is to blame, as well as the interesting way that inflation could be higher for you than the reported amount, as well as what the warning is inside of this report and what, if anything, is being done about it. So let's dive right in, and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so to make sure you keep on getting these Canadian updates. Now, here we're on Jagmeet Singh's Twitter account, and he's sort of coined this new term called greedflation. He's blaming corporate CEOs, bonuses, and record high profits as the real reason for inflation. Of course, this is what the NDP have been saying for quite a while now. And that's where this new report comes in, because it seems to support this theory. However, there are some numbers in here that we're going to get into that are a little bit questionable that we need to talk about. The paper is called 15 Super Profitable Industries Fuel Canada's Inflation, and it says, hey, there are 15 industries in Canada that have had exceptionally high record profits, and that's dragging up the overall inflation that we're seeing in Canada. Now, there's this graphic in the report that shows that labor compensation has only gone up 17.7% since 2019. That's the year that we're focusing on, and I have my 2019 shirt on here. Champs, let's go. But 17.7% increase for labor compensation, while after-tax corporate profits on average were up 46.6% again since 2019. But that measly 46.6% pales in comparison to the numbers I'm about to show you. Most of the companies in Canada had far less than 30% income growth after taxes, but the ones that had a higher growth than that dramatically dragged up the average from those lower numbers. Take a look at this. It shows the top increases in terms of corporate profits. We're going to go into more detail on these numbers because there are some things that we definitely need to consider, but take a look at this. Oil and gas extraction and service up 1,000% since 2019. That's essentially a 10x in annual net income, or their profit, right? And then we can see the percentages for other industries. I'll point out some notable ones. Mining is very, very high. Wood and paper products, as well as motor vehicle dealers. And then we have other industries as well, especially the one that's been most focused on by Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, which is retail grocery stores, right? He's been saying, hey, all of these the oligarchs that are owning these large corporations that manage Canadians' groceries, well, they're having record profits, and that's the reason we're seeing inflation. But compared to the higher rates of some other industries, it seems a little bit lower, with food and beverage retail being around 120% growth, just over a doubling since 2019, and 50% growth, just under 50% for food manufacturing in Canada. Now, the thesis that's being put forward here is that, well, these places that have the highest growth in profit have also been the places that Canadians have seen a large increase in the amount of they're paying for these related goods. But we do have to think about, okay, what unique circumstances happened over the past couple of years that might have actually made these numbers a reality. Because ultimately, greedflation, or just inflation, what the conservatives are saying is the problem, the government and the big central banks being the cause for inflation, as well as this global phenomenon idea. Likely, all of them aren't true in and of themselves, but maybe somewhere in the middle between all three of them, we can get closer to a real answer here. And actually, this report takes some shots at the Bank of Canada that we're going to get into in just a minute. But there's a number of things on this list of these highest increases in profits that I think are more temporary or more specific to the unique situation of the past couple of years. Oil and gas sector certainly, I think, is one of them, due to the war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. Large energy provider in Russia being sort of shut off from the market, increasing prices on that oil and gas, leading to larger than average profits, right? We've seen things here like mining as well, the commodities prices going up dramatically also as a result of this. Wood and paper products products over the pandemic with the supply chain bottlenecks. Again, I sound like a central banker with the reasons I'm giving now, but this is only a small piece of the pie, right? The same goes for motor vehicle dealers. We saw prices on both new and used cars go up dramatically over the pandemic, largely due to a shortage in chips, right? A chip shortage. There's so many little microcomputers that are used in modern day cars, and because of the supply chain issues that were happening during the pandemic, well, we had trouble getting all of those chips to make the cars. So again, less supply and more demand because of extra low interest rates over the pandemic means that these industries can charge more for their products and as a result make more. So we're seeing these incredibly high numbers for the amount that these companies have grown their net income since 2019. But why isn't that number being reflected in the CPI or the Consumer Price Index, the number that we use to measure overall inflation in Canada? It's sitting at just 6.9% year over year. So why aren't we seeing a higher rate there that's more in line with some of these numbers that we're seeing? Well, it might be interesting for you to find out that these large gains in certain sectors only represent a certain smaller portion of that consumer price index number. As a quick reminder, the CPI is made by looking at a bunch of different goods and services and tracking over time how much those goods and services cost, and each of those individual goods or categories of goods and categories of services are grouped into sort of different sections or different weightings inside of that basket. So some things that affect more Canadians more would be weighted more heavily in the basket, meaning it drags up the percentage of inflation more than a less important category. Again, this is all sort of determined by the folks who put together the CPI, which baskets are weighted what. And so the point that's being made in this chart is that these 8 areas that are associated with the super profitable sectors that we were just talking about make up only a smaller portion of that CPI. They're weighted less heavily in that basket of goods and services. So let me zoom in here and we can actually read what it is. In terms of these 8 categories, these subcategories that are exposed to these extremely high increases, well, they only make up 29.29% of total inflation, or that's the weight of these categories on the inflation number, whereas all the other items and categories that aren't exposed to these extremely high growth profit growth areas make up the other 70.71%. So even though we're seeing really high increases in certain areas, because it's not weighted as heavily inside of that basket, well, it drags up inflation less. These 8 subcategories on their own are showing 12% inflation year over year right now compared to last year, right? But we're not seeing that in inflation, right? Or in the number that we're looking at, the CPI, because it only really represents a 3.51% drag up of that inflation number, even though this is 12%, because it's weighted more lowly than other areas, it only drags it up 3.51%, whereas the other 70% of all of CPI drags it up the other 3.37%, getting us close to the 6.9% number that we're seeing today. So if you feel like you're experiencing a higher rate of inflation than that 6.9% number, maybe you have more exposure to some of these areas that have larger than average increases, again, compared to looking at this, which is all of the items that are inside of this weighted basket of CPI goods and services. Maybe you are exposed to the ones that are related to those companies that have the higher gains in net income. Now, it's pretty clear that this report is blaming these record profits for the inflation that we're seeing in the economy and how much it's sort of dragged up that inflation number, but it also warns that the Bank of Canada could be on the wrong track, and as a result, Canadians could suffer more pain over the long term than they really need to. You can see that right here in this section of the report. They say that they're suggesting that there's some critical insight for policymakers, some changes that the Liberal government could put into place, as well as the policymakers of monetary policy in Canada. The Bank of Canada, they control interest rates and whether or not there's any sort of fiscal stimulus put into the economy like we saw at the beginning of the pandemic with quantitative easing and their dramatic lowering of interest rates. And we're seeing the flip side of that now with the dramatic increase in interest rates to try to fight inflation. It's pretty clear that they're pointing out that it's the record profits in their eyes that is the biggest problem, but they also say that the Bank of Canada's assertion that inflation is a result of an overheated labor market and rising wages is untrue. That's what they're saying. I don't think the Bank of Canada really says that the inflation inflation is a result of these higher wages. Instead, they're far more focused on not wanting wages to get too out of hand in terms of the rate of increase, because they're afraid of a wage price spiral that could create self-enforcing inflation, right? Entrenched inflation that lasts for the long term. That's what they're scared of. But what they're saying here is that, hey, don't focus on wages, or at least this report is saying don't focus on wages, focus on profits, something that the NDP likely would like to hear. And they go on to say that, hey, this isn't normal, and it's not actually the case for most industries across Canada. They say outside of these 15 super profitable sectors, aggregate profits in Canada have declined since the pandemic. So outside of these large factors, if you were to take them out of the calculation, all the other sectors that they surveyed put together would actually have a negative number here, or the profits would have declined since 2019. So they're saying, hey, there's really only these big players that are really winning, and all of the little guys aren't winning here. So they say that the cold bath that the Bank of Canada is giving the entire economy by raising interest rates so dramatically is actually going to have a negative effect on workers long term, because as they raise interest rates, there's likely to be higher unemployment in the future. And that's what they're saying, is that, hey, we could be far more targeted with our response here. We could focus on the greedflation that they claim is a reality. Instead of giving this cold bath to the entire economy, we can just focus on the areas that are seeing the most profit and bring down inflation as a result of that. And they say there could be a couple solutions to this. One of them is an excess profits tax to recapture some of the surplus pocketed by these companies and their owners in the super profitable sectors. And then they say, hey, we could actually offer direct fiscal supports to consumers to help them with this issue, whether that's a tax credit or a direct financial rebate given to people. They say that this would offset the financial distress caused by these key sources of inflation. Of course, some of you might be thinking, hey, if we give more money to people, that's more demand in the economy, meaning they'll buy more things and we could have inflation for the long term. So that's something interesting to note, but these are some of the solutions. What's actually going on in terms of solutions there, though? The Liberal government actually has incorporated an excess profits tax. We've talked about this in a previous video. It's actually called the Canada Recovery Dividend, but it's far less expansive than certainly the NDP would like, and it seems like also this report would like as well. This Canada Recovery Dividend is only applied to certain industries, only 2 of those 15 hyper profitable industries since 2019. And those 2 industries have to pay 15% on their income over $1 billion for only 1 year, for 2021. So any amount they made over $1 billion in the year of 2021 will be paying an additional 15% tax on that income over that threshold. And the only 2 sectors that this applies to is banking and life insurance, right? 2 of those profitable sectors, but certainly not all of them, and certainly not the most profitable sector. So that led a lot of people to say, especially the NDP, hey, Liberals, we like that you're doing this windfall tax. We like that you're incorporating this Canada Recovery Dividend, but we'll work with you. Why can't we expand this to more industries that we're seeing are having record profits right now? Now, Chrystia Freeland had a little bit of an interesting response to this. She said, and I'm paraphrasing, but she said this in a finance committee meeting where she was questioned by the NDP alongside the Conservatives as well as the Liberals questioning Chrystia Freeland. Some softballs were definitely thrown there. But what Chrystia Freeland said when she was addressed by the NDP was that, hey, we only focused on the banking sector and the life insurance sector because those are the sectors that we believe we directly helped through the pandemic. They said, hey, we came in with all this fiscal stimulus. We took on all this debt. The Bank of Canada printed all this money, and we took on all this debt to do all of this spending, and we really only bailed out these 2 sectors. At least this is what Chrystia Freeland and the Liberals are saying. We didn't really impact the grocery sector, what the NDP is pushing for, or some of these other sectors that might have been included in this 15 most hyper profitable sectors list. We only really impacted life insurance and banking, which sounds a little bit far-fetched to some, that the huge stimulus, the hundreds of billions of dollars inserted into the economy, really only helped 2 industries. I'm curious what you think about that. But this report certainly gives us more insight into which sectors are doing well and which ones are dragging up that inflation number, as well as who they're blaming, the Bank of Canada and the fact that the Liberal government isn't incorporating those taxes. That's what this report believes, as well as why you might be feeling inflation a little more heavily, because the CPI numbers are a little bit skewed away from what might be your actual experience, as well as them warning the Bank of Canada not to increase the entire economy's interest rate that they're paying, and instead it might make more sense to target their actions, right? I'm curious what you think about all this. Do you think that this report is along the right lines, or do you think that it really is more of a monetary thing with the Bank of Canada's money printing and the Liberal government spending, or do you think it's something else entirely? No matter what you think, I want to hear from you in the comments section below. I read every single one. I try to get back to a bunch of them, and if you haven't already done so, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'm bringing constant Canadian updates that I hope you'll find useful, so hit that subscribe button. It's free and it helps out the channel dramatically. But with all that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.